I'm going to tell a changeling story that comes to us from County Kerry, Ireland. Years ago, there lived a beautiful young woman who was beloved by all who knew her. She always carried a rose bloom on her cheek and an emerald sparkle in her eyes. And when the time came, she made a good match. She married a handsome enough young fellow who had recently inherited his father's humble farm. And the two of them at first seemed happy, just going about the rhythms of their daily lives and labors. But they had not been wed for even a year before the trouble began. You see, the young woman, she began to feel this restlessness in her breast. And although she tried to tamp it down and concentrate on her chores and the daily duties of a farmer's wife, the more she tried, the more anxious she became. And her poor husband, he did not know what to do. And although he tried to pretend that all was well, inside he felt a dark foreboding. Well, one of her chores was to gather the water for the household from their well, which was very near a river. And one day she was there pulling up the pail from the depths below when she suddenly heard the sound of women singing, and their voices seemed to be flowing from the river. While she leaned in and listened, she suddenly felt that anxious flutter that had made a home in her heart quicken into longing. But she only let herself listen for a minute before she shrugged her shawl back on her shoulders, picked up her pail, and walked home. But the next day, she returned, and again she heard the sound of women singing. And this time, she also heard the sound of dancing. She heard the sound of their feet stamping the earth in time to the rhythm of a joyful drum. And she again felt that longing. But she again only let herself listen for a minute before she shrugged her shawl back on her shoulders, picked up her pail, and walked home. But that night, she decided she would tell her husband of what she had heard and of her desire to investigate. Well, listening to this tale of bacchant women reveling by the river, he felt a little bit uneasy. You see, he was recalling the fairy ring across the waters that his father had always warned him to stay clear of, and he offered his wife the same advice. But darling, if you had only heard the sound of their singing, such beautiful singing. You must stay away. No good will come of this. But dearest, if you had heard the sound of their dancing, such joyful dancing, I mean, really, what harm could come from just going down to the river and taking a quick peek? You must stay away. No good will come of this. Well, she wanted to be an obedient wife, or at least she thought she did. But the next day, when she again went to the well, and she again heard the sound of women singing, and she again heard the sound of women dancing, and she again heard that great, joyful drum. This time, she put down her pail, and she walked steadily to the waters. Well, that night, she came home late, shoes and shawl missing, feet caked with damp earth. And she was very, very ill. She collapsed into their bed in a feverish fit of dreaming, and she never woke up again. Her husband was heartbroken. He buried his young bride on their land and grieved. But before a year had passed, unable to bear the burden of his sorrows and his loneliness, he quickly took another wife. Well, 3 years later, he was at the well, and he was drawing that pail up from the depths below, when suddenly he heard the sound of footsteps approaching from the river. And how surprised he was when he turned and he saw her. She was running toward him, arms outstretched, shoes and shawl missing, feet caked with damp earth. "Dearest!" she exclaimed. But he backed away, thinking he was seeing an apparition. "Dearest, why do you move away from me?" "Don't be cross. I know I've been gone for 3 days, but what a wonderful 3 days they've been. Oh, the singing and the dancing. What tales I shall have to tell you." He looked at her. She seemed quite solid, not an apparition at all. And that rose bloom was back in her cheeks, and the emerald glow was back in her eyes. And she was so, so lovely. "You're alive?" "Oh, of course I'm alive, silly. Why do you look at me as though I were a ghost?" "Listen, I know I was gone for 3 days, but don't worry. I did not eat their bread. I remembered the rules that if you eat the food of the fairies, you could be trapped in their realm forever. And so I was careful and I did not eat any. And they've allowed me to return now to you." 3 days. 3 days, did you say? You've been gone for 3 years. And he told her then the tale as he knew it. And after he did, they both wept, for they realized that the fairies had sent a changeling woman in her stead, and it was that woman whom he had buried on their land. And time being so different there in the other world than it is in this one, where there 1 minute equals, or 1 day equals 1 year here, he had moved on and remarried. Not knowing what to do, he hid her in the barn and snuck her the scraps of the meals his second wife made him until he could seek the counsel of the parish priest. The priest listened intently. "Does anyone else know she's here?" "No, no, I swear on my good father's grave, not a soul." "Good, because you're going to have to send her back." "Send her back? Back where?" "Across the river to the women, the one she was singing and dancing with. You're going to have to send her back because you cannot have 2 wives." But what about her soul?" "Her soul is not your concern. You have been a good man, a righteous man, and you must remain so. You cannot have 2 wives." "I see." Well, he returned to the farm, and as they had arranged, he met his first bride at the well. Well, what did he say? "You must go." "Go? Go where?" "You must go back across the river to them." You see, I cannot have two wives. You forget me? You must leave. I cannot have two wives. You'll forget me? You must leave. Leave now! You forget me. And she backed away from him, her feet treading toward the water. And already she could hear the sound of women singing, and already she could hear the sound of women dancing, and already she could hear the sound of that great drum. And when her feet finally touched the river, the women, they circled around her, surrounding her with great cries and whoops until she could no longer see that man she had once called her husband. And she stood there in the center of their revelry, shocked and still, until finally one of the fairy women broke from their ranks and extended to her a generous portion of fragrant, honeyed bread. You are so, so hungry. And so she was. Thank you.